Welcome back to Basic Business Training 1, where last time we met, we were looking at boundaries and how to set boundaries in our business. Today we want to go a little bit further with boundaries, and this time we want to look specifically at how do we handle and manage our finances so that we can protect the business from ourselves and from other things that might come in and want to take from the business. And so we're going to use a word called budgets, and I've taught budgets for many, many years, and oftentimes when I say the word budget, it's like there's a chill that goes through the room. And so we want to try to dispel that and to say that budgets are part of a discipline, but it's a discipline that actually will provide freedom. And we believe that budgets are critically important as we look at stewardship, as we look at flourishing. And so we want to encourage you to understand that our goal in this is not to restrict, but it's actually to help you to grow, to flourish, to find contentment with your finances. I want to start off with a story, and the reason I want to read this story to you is sometimes as I have taught budgets across Africa for many years, I have had people, at least at the beginning, say, well, you know, you're North American, you have to have money in order to budget, and we don't have money. But I want to tell you that I have seen so many people who have very little income actually begin to budget, and their income ends up increasing. And I want to read a story to you from a woman, a Ghanaian woman, who shares her history, her development as it relates to budget and what she learned in her family. And the goal is that you hear from somebody who has gone through this, who is not a North American or is not Renita, at least in this process. So let me read this to you. A young lady named Charity went through a socialization process which was one of the most important parts of her upbringing. Her earliest recollection of this process as a little girl still brings a smile to her face and tears to her eyes. She said the entire family, mom, dad, brothers, and sisters, would sit down the first Sunday afternoon of each month at the table after church and after Sunday dinner. We didn't have much money. We would always take a look at Daddy's paycheck and then start doing our homework, which was the financial planning and the income allocation. Again, just a side note here, it's very unusual for children to know what parents are making, and sometimes it's unusual for spouses to know what the other spouse is making. And here is an example of a family that was very open and transparent with that. She continues to say both parents' paychecks were earmarked for all current bills. After that, the upcoming expenses for the month were estimated. Her father's income was also allocated for certain key categories, such as groceries. And she says they ate a lot of beans at certain months when they had to make it for less. Despite having to eat a lot of beans, they never failed to give generously to noble causes. Living for less enabled her parents to fund their education because of their hard work and the financial prudence on the part of both of her parents. Charity is very successful today because of the nurturing environment that her parents provided. Her parents demonstrated respect for each other and for their children. They were frugal, and they planned and accounted for every penny of their income. Their children were treated as adults rather than infants and were always involved in the Sunday family planning meetings. Each child would make his or her requests and proposals to the planning board, which was the family. She said that if they needed a new textbook or shoes, she would have to explain to the family the reason and the rationale behind the request. Each child had to plan for the meeting and conceptualize a logical theme for the funding. And if one could not, then no money would be earmarked for that item. Charity wondered, imagine if all children grew up in such an environment. They would have leadership skills in knowing how to run business meetings, disbursements, how to budget, as well as empathy for the needy before the age of 10. The regular meetings were not for finance issues only, but for discussion about household chores and also time to inquire about how everyone's vision and goals were being fulfilled regarding their schoolwork. Her parents made chores fun because they took part. Charity is much more successful and financially better off than that of her parents, but she trains her children in the same principles and manner, and her kids also appreciate that a lot. She began planning for her children before they were born. The fact that Charity and her siblings knew about family obligations made them better planners and investors. The question is, what if Charity's parents had different standards? For example, what if they had a six-figure income, did little to no budgeting and planning, and were hyper consumers? They would have communicated a very different message to their children. The kids would be spoiled. They would expect things to be done for them at no matter what the cost. All income would be spent on consumer goods, and the kids wouldn't be appreciative of their parents because they didn't teach their kids, let alone have them think about noble causes. Parents must take time to share these values. It is not difficult to do. They can be creative about explaining what money is and its alternative uses. After all, there is magic in compounding of interest and dividends over a lifetime of investment. That is Charity's story, and it is a story that we don't hear very often, almost no matter where we are. The teaching of our children to manage finances, to understand how to do that before they leave the home, can be a real challenge. And oftentimes we consider money to be very private, and it's something that we keep to ourselves. I've seen sometimes in cultures that in marriage the two become one in all ways except financially. It's something that we keep apart and we keep separate. And what I wonder about is how can we be successful as a family and as a marriage couple if we are not one in all ways, if we are not sharing and making our goals? Because the finances are not a standalone. They are part of our strategic vision and our plan for our family, for our business, and for our lives. And so in the last session, we talked about how dangerous it is to cross your own boundaries, to cross your own walls, your own barriers, and put your hand into that pocket where the money belongs to your business. And in this session, we want to look at how do we decide how much the business can afford to pay us. Most of us started the business in order to put food on the table. We also started it because it's a calling, or maybe we now believe it's a calling. But an important part of business is that we are able to take care of our families. And so how can we make a decision about how much the business can give us? Oftentimes when I'm teaching a class, I will ask people, how many of you take a salary from your business? And almost no hands go up. How many of you, I then ask, how many of you take small from your business every day? You take a little bit. Almost everybody's hands go up. Well, the danger, of course, is when you are taking a little bit from your business every day, there's no control. You are taking it based on your needs and not based on a plan. And, of course, we know that planning is very important because needs will always come up. Money has a way of finding leaks. It is able to leak out. It's able to find a need. And what we want to do as stewards of God's creation, as stewards of God's business, is to respond in a prayerful and a planning way to what the business needs in order to be able to help it thrive and to flourish so that it can continue to provide for our family, so that it can continue to provide for customers, so that it can continue to provide for employees. And so one of the things we have to think about is, do we have access to the inventory and think that it doesn't hurt the business if we as a family help ourselves to the provisions that maybe we are to be selling? Sometimes we want to be nice now to somebody instead of saying no and being able to provide for them later because, again, we have a lack of boundaries in our ability to say no either to ourselves, to friends, to family members, or to fellow church members. And so our goal in this session is to identify as part of our management, which is part of establishing healthy walls, strong walls in our business. If you think back to the picture that we have of the business, we want to have strong walls to protect the business, and that includes setting a salary for business owners. What can the business afford to pay you? Owners should see themselves as an employee and only take a set amount, just like an employee would take a set amount. Now, there are some things that we can talk about at a different time relating to if the business doesn't pay you enough, you shouldn't take a salary. You actually are not an employee, you are the owner. But we'll talk about that in a subsequent session. For now, we're going to think about the fact that we want you to set an amount, just like an employee would have an amount. That is your salary to take. And just know that you need to weigh in. If you don't have sales and you still take that salary because you deserve it, you're going to be breaking down the business. But on average, we're hoping that your business is able to produce what you need in order to have a salary. And so we have to understand what the business is able to pay us, we have to have a good understanding of our own budget. Now, my experience in doing financial freedom classes for families is that many of us don't know what we even need in a month in order to cover all of our costs. And so my encouragement for you is to do this exercise. My encouragement for you to start is that you do it for a month. But if you really want to learn how to have a good budget, you might want to do this for 3 months. And that is to carry a piece of paper with you, a pad of paper, or you can get apps on your phones if you're able to do that, to track every piece of money that comes into your hand, into your family, household, and everything that you spend money on. And the idea is that often we don't know where our money is going. I have done budgets with many people, and they are often surprised at how much they spend, especially on areas like food and on transport, until they begin adding it up. And so the idea that we want to have is that you begin to develop a track record. You begin to learn by discipline where your money is going, where your money is coming from. Now, for some people, that's a very difficult thing to ask. And I've heard of great creative ways that people have done, and you can discuss that amongst yourself after the session. I remember one couple that was intentional about wanting to learn to get on a budget, and they wanted to flourish. And what they did is that they had a bowl at their entranceway. And so when they came into the house, there was a bowl that was there. There were pieces of paper and a pen. And each of them would write down, when it was still fresh in their mind, what they spent money on and whether they got in any money. And they'd drop it on the bowl, and then they would go into the house and be able to forget about it. And then once a week, maybe on a Saturday, they would take that bowl out and they would go through everything and say, okay, this is food, and this is transport, and this was for the children, and so on. And then they were able to look at their budget. And so it's important for you to find a way to do this that fits within your lifestyle, that fits within a way that will be good for you. But without knowledge, we are not able to find that freedom. And so we need that knowledge. We need to have an understanding of where our money is going if we want to be able to flourish and be able to see that it can grow and that we can prosper. So we have to keep the money separate, and that's the very first important thing. The business money is not your money. The business money belongs to the business. The business is a separate legal entity. God is the owner of that business. You are the manager of that business. And as a manager, you have a responsibility to protect it from outsiders, from those who might steal from it, as well as from yourself. And so our encouragement, our request in this is that you begin to separate that money. And you do that by figuring out what is your part, what is your portion. And so we want to take a look at that. We have to think through some of the difficult things that we might face, however, in doing budgets, in having budgets, in coming up with ways of protecting the business from ourselves. I remember teaching this class, and we went through boundaries and we went through budgets. And one of the men left the class that day, and he came back the next week and he said, I have a testimony that I need to share. His name was Isaiah, and he had gone through the training, and when he went home that day and he was thinking about the fact that he had just been paid for something on his way to the class that day, and the business money was in his pocket. And as it was, he left the class and was thinking about boundaries and how does he separate himself from his business. And on his way home, he ran into his brother. And his brother told him that his brother's son, his nephew, was sick and was in the hospital, and his brother was looking for some financial help in order to help pay for his son's care. Now, this man, Isaiah, had a dilemma. He had just heard the class that the money in his pocket belonged to the business, and yet his brother's son was sick, and what was he to do? So he told his brother, you know what, brother, I will get back to you. I need to go and take care of some things, and I will get back to you on what I'm able to do. And he went into his home and he prayed, and he really was conflicted. The brother's son was not deathly ill. I mean, if the son was deathly ill, then that would be a different response. And he had malaria, and he wasn't feeling great, but it was not a life and death issue. And he just wondered, God, this is your business. What do I do? And I think that the solution that Isaiah came up with shows the creativity of us as we ponder what God has given us to do and what we are able to do. And Isaiah said that after he finished praying, he opened his eyes, and in front of him was a TV set that he had just recently bought for his family. And he looked at that TV set and he thought, you know what? I don't really need that TV set. I would rather that my brother's son is healthy and fine and that I protect my business money. So I'm going to sell that TV set, give that money to my brother, and I will have protected God's business. I will have loved my brother and his son, and I am able to go on. And so that was how he resolved that challenge. And we all have different things that we can do, different capacities that we have in order to be able to solve some things. Other people, when they have heard of this dilemma and we ask, what would you do if you were Isaiah? And some of them have said that, well, they would say, we can only contribute this amount, but you need to go to other family members, or we need to ask, more questions, or we need to understand and have a family meeting and know a little bit more. And you know your own context, you know your own family, you know what your obligations are, you also know what your limits are. And so we have to think through some of these challenges as we begin to separate ourselves from our business. And so what we want to encourage you to do as you begin this process is we encourage you to start as a family. And we can talk about business budgets, especially in Basic Business Training 2. We will look more at business budgets. Right now, our goal is for you to begin to understand what your personal family budget is so that you can decide how much the business is able to pay you. And so there are three main recommendations that we have for family budgeting. The first is that you do it together, husband and wife, as well as the children, not just for the planning, but also for the follow-through and accountability. And that is one of the things that we did as a family. When our children were young, I made sure that if I was taking care of bills and expenses, that they were aware of what we were doing, that they had an understanding that if we said, no, you cannot have that, it's because we have decided as a family that we have some goals we believe God has called us to in order to be able to live into what his calling and vision is for our family. But husbands and wives, it's important that you develop a strategy, a strategic plan for your family. What do you want to see happen for your children and their education, or for your housing situations? And again, we want to make our plan then fit, our finances fit that plan so that we can be successful. We need to have a goal, and so it's important that we identify that goal so that as we deny ourselves certain things that we like, we may be able to fulfill it in other areas. The other thing is that we need to keep it simple, and this is very important. We want to have a simple system, a simple way of tracking, a simple way of understanding and dealing with the budget so that it is practical and that it is doable at the end of the day. Sometimes we have systems that are very complex and we end up running away from it very quickly. There are some basic things that we want to understand about budgets, and the first is what is called the 50-20-30 rule. And as we get into this, and in your workbook you will see a budget, and we'll be going through a budget pretty soon, the recommendation is that 50% of your income goes for fixed costs. And fixed costs are those things that you have to pay no matter what. And so it doesn't mean that the number is always the same, but it does mean that it is not an option for you to pay or not pay. And those are generally things like your rent or your mortgage, if you have a mortgage, the lease that you might have on the place where you are living. Another thing is electricity, or if you are paying for water. Those are fixed costs. Those are things that are something that you have to pay. Other things that we might place into fixed costs, and we'll look at that on the budget in a few minutes, might be savings that we want to say that this is a cost. This is something that we want to treat as an expense that's mandatory we do every month, and we'll talk more about that, as well as maybe our tithes and so on. Then we say that 20% of income should go for financial goals. And the financial goals are the things that we have planned for. And again, if you want to grow and to prosper, we have to make some of those plans and move in that direction. And then lastly, 30% of our income should be for flexible costs. And flexible costs are things that can vary from month to month. And that would include our groceries, that would include our shopping, entertainment that we might have. It might include the type of transport that we take, and so on. And so let's look now at the budget, and I want us to walk us through how to do this. At the bottom of the budget, you will see a place for you to put your total income, your total household income. But for the most of the part, we're going to be looking at the expenses. On the left hand of the budget, you will see our fixed expenses. And those are the ones, as I said, that are all listed there that are requirements typically that you pay, and they may vary in the amount, but they are fixed in that you owe somebody, and that is not always within your control how and when to pay. On the right-hand side, you see flexible expenses, and as I said, those are ones that you have a little bit more control over. And so you will see then two categories. You will see the list of expenses, then you will see which are monthly and which are annual. And sometimes when we do a budget, we remember the things that we pay on a monthly basis, but we don't always remember the things that we pay on an annual basis. And so we'll go through that together. Sometimes if we pay it annually, we want to be able to put money aside every month so that when that annual bill comes, we are ready and prepared for that. Now, how do you do the budgeting? Once we make some decisions about what the amounts are, when you have banks and you are able to access a bank account, you might be able to keep your money in the bank and keep it safe in that way. What I have found is that for a lot of people, sometimes it works to have envelopes in a home and keep it in a very safe place, and you put money aside for different things in those envelopes, and that way when it's finished, and you are not able to touch them anymore. One of the things that we are seeing, of course, across the world is we are moving more and more away from currency, from actually using cash, and we are moving more and more towards using credit cards or debit cards. I remember when my son was young and we went to the grocery store, and this was still a little bit before we were using credit cards for everything, and I had a checkbook. And he said, "Mommy, can I have whatever?" And I said, "I don't have the money for that." And he said, "But you've got all that paper in that book." There's a lack of understanding that the checkbook actually is associated with an amount of money in the bank. If we go back further in time, a long time ago, our parents might have different jars where they would put money in as special savings, and as children, we're able to visualize where that money went. And today, so much of our money we just don't see anymore, and so it's become even more difficult for children to learn and to understand, and yet it's so important for them to learn this before they leave the home. So let's look at our fixed expenses. As we think about our fixed expenses, the first item that's listed there is tithes. Oftentimes, if we are looking at the Old Testament, we're thinking about 10%. In the New Testament, of course, we are encouraged to give generously. And so you have to know for yourself what your tithe is. One of the things that I love to encourage married couples to do is start at 10% when you get married and add 1% every year, as much as God can allow you to do that. But what you might not know yet is what 10% is, because you don't know what your income is going to be. That's the process we're going through now. So you might have to leave that blank and come back to that later. But you may feel that 10% is what you want to do, and so you need to keep that in mind. The next thing is the offerings that we give, which are separate than the tithes. And so how much might you want to set aside on a monthly basis? And sometimes if you haven't been tracking, or maybe you're going to do this a month from now after you have been, you'll take a look to see how much you actually gave in offerings on a monthly basis. Remember, I said earlier, the next category is savings, and we believe that having 3 months of savings is critical for your fixed costs. That means that if something were to happen to you, if you are not able to work, if you become sick, that you are at least able to cover your costs for the household for 3 months. And we have seen that many people have the capacity to save, but because we don't treat it like an expense, we often don't save, and that money finds a way of going to other places. But again, our desire is that we flourish, that we are able to take care of our needs, and so having a savings account for a business as well as for a family is very important. 3 months of fixed cost is recommended for a business as well. Then we have education, and this has been an ongoing frustration for me. There are many people that I have worked with that continue to take loans for education for their children. And what that means is that they are paying the loan and they are paying interest. And sometimes it's a loan that what we say is for consumption. It's not a loan that actually is going to give you a return on your money. We want to encourage you to take loans for business only because business loans will actually help you to grow your investment and can give you money back. But a loan that's taken for a wedding or for a funeral or for education is basically a loan for consumption. You have to pay it back plus interest, and you are in worse situation than before that happened. I like to tell the story of my father. My father was an immigrant from the Netherlands to Canada after the Second World War. And he went to buy a car for the first time. And he was horrified when he saw the interest that he would have to pay. My father taught me budgeting at a very young age and held on to money very tightly. And so the story doesn't surprise me. It was from before I was born. And so he thought, I will never pay interest like this again. And so what he decided to do was that he would make one payment to the bank of the principal and the interest that he owed on that car, and he made one payment to himself. Now, he was a very poor student. He was an immigrant who had just come and arrived. He didn't have much of anything. The only way that he could do that was if he only ate peanut butter and bread for 18 months. 18 months. He made a payment to the bank, he made a payment to himself, and he made himself sick on peanut butter. But at the end of that time, he was able to have the money for his next car. And when the next car was needed, he had the money that was there, and he never paid interest on a car loan again. He also never ate peanut butter again because he came to hate peanut butter. And for the rest of his life, and he's 93 years old now, he never touched peanut butter again. But it's that type of sacrifice that even for school fees, for children that you have, if you were to make one payment for the loan and one payment to yourself, you might have to suffer and struggle and tighten your belt for 6 months. But if you can get ahead of that so that the next time you pay cash and you continue to make payments to yourself and you don't touch it because it's for education, you will be saving yourself money and stress and being a good steward of your resources. Next, we see payments for taxes, whether you have to pay those directly, your house rent or your mortgage, your maintenance for the house. Many of you have house help and that you have to pay. You have to put that in your budget. Your phone, your scratch cards that you use, whatever you're paying for energy, for electricity or for gas, whether you're paying for water, for garbage, for security, whether you have loans or debts that you owe. And you can see all of those that are listed in the expenses. Down towards the bottom is where you see some of those annual payments, and you might have auto insurance that comes once a year, but often it's not a small bill, and so to set something aside every month, and so that when that bill comes, it's not a burden to you. And that's one of the things I've heard, and I've loved to have heard from people who begin to do budgeting. It's like, bring on the bill. I'm prepared for it. I've planned for it. I've got the money. Every month I set aside a certain amount. When the car insurance payment came, I was able to make the payment. Just recently I heard from one of my colleagues in Northern Africa, and he did not do that. He did not put the car insurance on his vehicle that he was using for his multiple businesses as well as for ministry, and got into a car accident and is now stranded. And so that is the challenge that we have. Yes, it takes discipline to do that, but that discipline brings contentment and it brings freedom when you are able to protect the assets that God has given you. Home insurance, household insurance, health insurance, life insurance, all these different things that I know are challenges in some places. If we buy health insurance or life insurance, does that mean we might die? And those are discussions that you can have. But certainly what we want to do is to think through what would God have us do as a steward of our life, of our body, of our health, and for our family. On the right-hand side, we then look at our flexible expenses. And this is where you have a lot more control. And the first one that's there is groceries and supplies, or food and supplies. When I was married, early in our marriage, we sat down and we did our first budget, and we made a decision of what our goals were for our family, what it was we were going to achieve. And at that time, we wanted to be able to get our own house, and so that was a priority, and it meant that we were going to try to save money from other areas to be able to help us to be able to get a house. And I remember that my husband said to me, you know what, you're good with numbers, you're good with money, you handle the budget, and we made the decisions together, and I said, that's great, because I knew he wasn't that good with money. And so we started the month in our first budget, and about 3 weeks into the month, he said, I'm going to the store to get some food, and I said, whoa, wait a minute, we finished the money for food for the month. And he said, what do you mean? I know that we have money in the bank. And I said, no, we made a decision in our budget that we would only spend this amount on food, and we have spent it all. Well, now we had a dilemma. Do we follow the budget, or do we say, well, it's okay if we go over? We decided, no, we are going to follow that budget. And so what we did for the rest of that month was eat whatever we could still find in our cupboards. And the next month, we were much more careful about how we used our money. And so that is one of the biggest spending leaks, that people are almost always surprised at how much they spend on food when they begin to track it every day. Eating out is also something that's on the increase in many countries, and it usually costs a little bit more than cooking for yourself. How much are you spending on eating out on a monthly basis? Laundry, travel is another thing. You're paying for travel, not just for yourself, but maybe for your spouse and for your children as well to get back and forth. How much are you spending on that? And do you have flexible options in there? Clothing. Often we don't buy clothes every month. We may buy clothes twice in a year. Do we want to set something aside so that when the time for buying clothes comes, we are able to buy clothing and not have it be such a burden? Do we have appliances that we need to keep up? Do we have community contributions that we want to make? Do we have family contributions that we need to make? I used to put in the budget that we would set money aside for weddings and funerals, and then people told me that's not really okay. We don't want to plan for funerals. And so we say family contributions, but I want you to know those are the things that you have to plan for, because people will die, people will get married, people will have babies, people will have different events, and we need to put it in our budget so that we know what our obligations are, but we also know what our limits are, and we can give out of that particular line item what we have allocated and decided as a family to give, and then not give beyond that. Giving to the poor is also listed there. Again, we have tithes and offerings, but we also have an understanding that we have obligations, and we want to be loving, and we want to be generous in our giving, and so you can allocate money for those different areas. Anniversaries is the next one, and birthdays and Christmas could be in there as well. And one of my biggest frustrations, again, is Christmas. We have accepted this idea that Christmas is about gifts, and many of us go into debt as we prepare for Christmas. And Christmas is a time of great stress as we seek to buy clothing and everything for everyone in our families. And one of the things I often say is that, does anybody not know when Christmas is? And of course, I'm sure all of you know when Christmas is. If you are in a country that actually celebrates Christmas, you might not be. But one of the things in many countries is that, yes, we know it's December 25, we know it's coming, but we don't plan for it. And so Christmas ends up being this burden, and it ends up not being a celebration of joy, of the gift that God has given us. And we end up in debt, and we end up stressed out, and January ends up being a very dark month. Then we also have grooming and recreation. Maybe we can plan for a vacation. Maybe we need to pay for internet, hobby subscriptions, pocket money, and so on. And the idea is that you need to go through all of these and list out what you believe you spend, or maybe you're tracking and you see what you spend. And now comes the important part, where you look at your total income and you add up your total expenses and you see whether or not you have a positive balance. Most of the time when people start this process, they end up at a negative balance. And so we have to then adjust something in our expenses. If you don't know how much the business should pay you, you may be at just seeing what your expenses are. And I've had many people say, the business cannot afford to pay me that. And yet they've been taking that all along because they didn't do the math. And so this is where it's so important that we do the math and we really look at a difficult situation to say, what expenses can I reduce in order to help my business to flourish so that I am not eating too much of the assets of the business. And so those are some of your assignments. I encourage you to have a meeting with your family to talk about it. I encourage you to start working through the budget, and I mostly encourage you to begin tracking your expenses day by day, both the income and the expenses, so that you know what God is doing in and through you with your finances and that you can be a good steward for Him. Thank you so much for your time. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.